Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman podcast.
There could be that person is only interested in the money and they don't care about anything else. And they're the people that often, in my experience, don't hit their targets because they're just chasing that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, rushing around like mad fools and getting nowhere.
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman podcast, and welcome to today's show. On today's show we have Peter Gold, who's a sales expert, and we're diving into the importance of knowing your why and your product's why and your business's why. It gets quite deep. Peter goes back and forth with me. He quizzes me in the middle of the show and narrows down my why of why I'm doing the podcast, which is interesting because I got some insights out of this personally as well. And yeah, if you enjoy this and you want to learn more about Peter, head over to storyfied.com, which is STORIFYD.com, storyfied.com. And his book, The Growth Factor, is available on Amazon as well. The book, the links, everything that we talk about is available in the show notes over at salesman.red/184. And so with that, without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, Peter, and welcome to the Salesman podcast.
Hi, Will. Thanks for having me.
You are more than welcome, sir. Today we're going to talk about the why and how that helps salespeople, the why of the individual, the why of the corporation, of the business, and a whole lot more. And I feel that this episode could go very deep very quickly. So to keep it on a wide, broad scale, just to start off with, do all companies have a why? And I'll tell you perhaps a little bit about a couple of anecdotes for myself after this, but do all companies have a why?
I think all companies have a why, but they don't necessarily, one, know what it is, or two, remember to actually tell anybody what it is. And I think over the years it changes as well.
Because I know from my personal experience, without naming the corporations themselves, I've worked for one big medical device company. Everyone knows the name of them. They do cameras and other bits of kit as well, so they're consumer focused as well. They didn't seem to have any why whatsoever, and it was never passed on to us as almost a sales tool as a why. I moved from them to their biggest competitor, who were a family-owned company, but still a billion-dollar business. They had an amazing why. Essentially, the lady who owned it, all the surgeons loved her, and there was a real personal story in that, and that became a real sales tool for me. So, to add a bit of context and paint a bit of a picture, Peter, and I know personally how useful having a why is. Why doesn't every company have a why, have it amazingly written, having it copy writ out for us so we can almost read it verbatim? Why don't companies invest into this?
I think it's like a lot of things in companies. Some people do things well, some people don't do things so well. And I think sales tends to be, particularly in the tech world, which is where I work, it's very much numbers driven. And as the tech businesses get bigger and bigger, they just, like I say, they generally forget their why. And it almost feels a bit false when they try and get new salespeople who are coming in, maybe from competitor organizations, very numbers driven, and kind of almost saying, well, we've got this reason why we exist. People just think, it's just a bit naff. Why would we bother telling anybody that? Who cares? And I guess it's got to come from the top. The people at the top absolutely have to be clear on why they do what they do. And as I say, it changes over years. And so people never think it's relevant as they get older. So if you take a startup that's maybe grown from nowhere, didn't know they had a why, but they had a why. So it may have been, they were just used to tell people the reason we started this business is because we think the big vendors, they're too expensive. They don't provide a great service. We want to provide, software as a service where services are the beginning, not the end of the process. But as they get bigger, they tend to lose their way a little bit. And before they know it, there may be 10 million turnover, they've been bought out by somebody, and all that history's gone. Mm-hmm. And so nobody kind of reinvents the history. And then it just gets lost.
And it's super fascinating to me as well. And I want to come on to the idea of us as an individual, as a salesperson, what value we can perhaps add if we have a why that ties into the whole thing. But you mentioned then that they and the royal they here of, the customer, perhaps even the salespeople think that why would anyone care about having a why? Yeah. Why do people? What's the psychology behind people caring about it? Because clearly people do, and I buy into a business if I feel like there's it's more of a human-led thing, and I'm dealing with an individual rather than I'm dealing with just a number.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the old kind of thing, people by people, and purpose matters more than product. So, if you meet somebody, let's say for example, you're buying um, new printed material for your business, like buy a load of business cards, and you call a couple of printers in, and one printer is very much numbers driven. How quickly can we close this deal? When will you make a decision? What's more important? Is it about price or is it about quality? And constantly trying to close you. And the next person comes in and they will really understand a little bit about you, and then they kind of come on saying, well, the reason we want to know this information about you because our history is all about providing good service because we've been burnt in the past from a bad supplier. You build that relationship based on your why and their why, and that's why to me it's so important.
And you kind of summed it up then, and I feel like this is an important point to stop on, and there might not be an answer to this. Is there a framework, a process to go from hi, new prospect, to here's our story, to then going back into the business conversation? Is there a step-by-step way of doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And part of what I do when I work with clients, I always help them work out their why, but also then their story as well. And it's how you can communicate that absolutely as part of the sales process, but it has to be from the heart and it has to be genuine. You can't just make something up. And I think that's where people sometimes struggle. They think, oh, we're just making this up to keep our customers happy. But if you dig hard enough, if I asked you, why do you do your podcast? There'll be a reason for it, and eventually you kind of get to that soapbox moment, and you get somebody kind of almost jumping up and down about the thing that kind of makes them angry about their industry, and that's very often their why. And you can even take that down to a personal level as well. So we can talk about what your personal why as well as the business why.
Well, let's dive into the personal why while you've mentioned it then. And then I want to come back to the process of putting it all in place. Because I think I want to be able to give the audience from this episode the opportunity and the ability to walk away from this, because they're probably listening on the way to a sales meeting right this second, and to be able to use some of this right in that next sales meeting perhaps. So
if they're not going to a sales meeting, where are they going?
Yeah, well, where shouldn't they be going? So let's get on to the personal why. So again, and tell me if I'm wrong here, I might be way off, but I feel like the salesperson who has, and it's massively cliche, I know, the salesperson who can connect on that one-to-one basis the best with the prospect, build the rapport, all that good stuff, is aside of price, functionality, all that stuff, which is able to be malleable, is most likely to win the business. And I feel one of the best ways to do this is to have a story and not just be that next salesperson who's trying to ram the company's pitch down your throat. So I feel like having a good why and having a good story is a really good platform to be able to do this. But what happens when the salesperson listening right now and they go, I'm literally just here for the money? How do they come up with a why or a story or a reason behind the being with the company, perhaps, to add emphasis to all of this?
So there's kind of two scenarios there. There could be that person is only interested in the money and they don't care about anything else. And they're the people that often, in my experience, don't hit their targets because they're just chasing that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, rushing around like mad fools and getting nowhere. And very, very often that's because they haven't got a why. Whereas the salesperson, you've got to say, why are you doing this job, really? They might go, oh, it's because of the money. And very often, it's not just because of the money. It's either because they love technology or they actually believe in their industry, or it could be something even deeper than that. They go, well, look, this technology really is saving lives. But they've got to be able to really understand why are they doing what they do. And I mean, somebody I knew in business, he was forever doing adventure stuff. And I used to say to him, I was saying, I don't believe you're doing this from the heart. You're doing this purely to try and have stories to tell people, to impress them as part of your sales process, rather than you do this adventure stuff because you genuinely like the outdoors. And that was the reason he was doing it, purely to impress people. And it didn't work because people could see through the story that, yeah, you didn't really do it quite as well as you said you did it. And it's very much a story. So say it's got to be there from the heart really, and for a real reason. And I know salespeople probably listen to this now thinking, "Oh, what a load of old tosh that is. It's not going to work. We're here just for the money. Every salesperson's here for the money. My sales manager just wants me to hit my numbers." Yeah, you do have to hit your numbers. And the best way, in my experience, of hitting your numbers is to be honest and genuine with your prospects, but actually knowing why you're doing what you're doing, even if it's just to feed the family. But let's or if you want to get on in life, but if it's just about the money and nothing else, you won't succeed.
Mm-hmm. So I've talked about it on the show before. My why for doing the podcast is very simply to grow a big enough audience to make enough money to semi-retire at the age of 33. That's my goal, end goal. I've talked about it a bunch of times, and I've talked about how I've even got I think it's about 3,000 word blog post, which I'll link in the show note to this episode, which talks about essentially how sales is probably going to make you ill, stressed, fat, and if you don't, if you're doing it long term and you've not got an end goal in mind, sales is an amazing career to have because you've got leverage over your income, which most roles don't have, most jobs don't have. But it obviously takes perhaps a toll on you if you're going full pelt at it. So if you don't have a good why, it's perhaps not even the best career to be in because it can take its toll on you as a person. But everyone,
why do you want to retire or semi-retire at 33?
So
what does that give you?
That gives me freedom of time. It gives me freedom of things like having a family. I want to be able to stay at home. Obviously, working with the podcast allows me to work from home and stuff as well. My girlfriend's a doctor, so she does crazy shifts. So that's not going to change. And so it's a half family, half selfish, and half somewhat sensible move, I think, of being able to buy property, being able to buy somewhat of passive, semi-passive investments to be able to give me a baseline and give my family a baseline whilst I continue to grow then whatever we've got at that point, if that makes sense.
Okay, but you say you want to kind of get that semi-retirement, but so this podcast, why do you do this specific podcast? What's the point of it? Who are you trying to help and why?
So I'm trying to help our audience, Sales Nation, because I feel there's a huge gap in the market between people who are creating content podcasts who are trying to sell you something, and there's always a end goal of theirs to push you down in a certain direction. I have people like yourself on the show, and of course you're getting value out being in front of our audience. I've no doubt about that. And Sales Nation appreciate that and are super responsive to buying books and all that kind of thing. But they are getting a crap ton of value from you in our conversation today as well. So I'm helping change the perspective and help salespeople move from this world of cold calling and sales management, shoving that down people's necks, to the world of selling through the internet and having diverse guests on than perhaps other shows where we talk about online marketing and other things as well that clearly sales is moving towards. So I get where you're going with this, and you can carry on with your questioning because you'll get more out of me than perhaps what I've shared on the show so far about all this. But I'm very conscious that I'm helping people. But and Jim Cathcart, who came on the show recently, reaffirmed this with me, that you've got to be able to help people profitably. I can't remember how the way he phrased it, but it's got to be sustainable. For me, It's sustainable in that I'm not selling the audience anything other than the podcast sponsors that I bring on, which I sell the ad space on the podcast still. So everything that we talk about, when we talk about the why today, it'll make me think about how I can better serve the podcast sponsors. Then I write that back up in a blog post. So the guests come on, the audience are the guests. I get the advice, I try it, get a feedback loop, and I report this back to the audience as well. So I'm constantly trying things that people are recommending, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. So that was a long answer to your question, but
I wouldn't normally be finished now. You see, again, not wanting to kind of take over the show, but
go for it.
I would ask you again why. Why do you care about helping people? And if I look back at my kind of why, I know that one of my kind of skills over the years has been actually helping people make more of themselves, and I get a lot of pleasure from that. And I do believe the more you give, the more you get. So I found when I was a sales director that I was able to better develop my team, which made them perform better and see them go on to greater things. And that's why, one, I carry on doing that now in kind of sales consulting and sales training, But the reason kind of behind it is because I've felt in the past I've not had the help and advice and coaching that's available today, and I don't want to see people struggle unnecessarily in the same way I did. I mean, I left school and I was a mechanic. I was a heavy goods vehicle mechanic at the local council wearing bright orange overalls. Anybody in bright orange overalls these days is probably locked up somewhere. But I kind of eventually found my way into sales and kind of a better life, let's say. And so my why is I want to try and help people accelerate through their life a lot quicker than I did by giving them help. So going back to your why, you keep digging and you keep digging, and I would keep pushing to you eventually, and I'd get you on this kind of soapbox moment where you'd start ranting and raving a little bit about you're sick of these scammy kind of online marketers flogging stuff to salespeople who are trying to learn their trade, and it's just a waste of their money, and it really makes your blood boil, and you just don't want to see that scenario anymore, and you're trying to change that market by doing something better or whatever it will be. And it's trying to get right down into that kind of heart moment, that soapbox moment where you really kind of get to the detail of why you really do what you do. Because the retirement thing's a little bit of a red herring. Yeah, it really is. It's like, because arguably you could have some of that life now anyway, and probably do have some of that life now. There's something else driving you behind why you do what you do.
But I would challenge that somewhat, though, and you can tell me whether this is right or wrong, whether I'm just not, whether I've not dove deep enough into it. But if I didn't think I could retire at 33, if I didn't think that, if I didn't see the huge growth in the audience like we do, if I didn't, and some of it comes back to every day I get, say, 20 to 50 emails from people saying, hey, love this show, Will, keep it up. And obviously there's encouraging, motivation emails because we're putting out a show every day. It's a crap load of work. There's no big team behind the Salesman podcast. There's essentially myself and Sarah, the producer, who works part-time, who helps out on getting the guests on and that kind of thing. But I'm doing all the editing, all the video, all the promotion, everything. That might change in time, of course. But without those emails coming in, that keeps me going day to day. But what does keep me going at the end of it is that thought of retirement. Now, where I'm going with this is that a selfish why? Is that something that I shouldn't share with customers? Or is that the open, honest, and genuine why, and should I be sharing that with people? And again, from the ad sales perspective of I'll try whatever we suss out now, and I'll report back to the audience whether I tell a potential sponsor that and they tell me to get lost because I'm being selfish.
I think, like I say, I think it's a bit of a red herring. I think the money you hope to earn from the podcast will give you the life you think you want, or probably do want. But my point is that if the revenue comes in for the podcast, and you can maybe hire more people so you work fewer hours and you have more automation in place, you might actually go, hang on a minute, why would I retire? I've got a million views a month. I'm making all this money. I've got a great team around me. What will I actually do now if I all of a sudden stop the podcast? So actually what you're driving towards is a better life.
Hey, I
better
know.
life, so you can do what?
Let me jump in here a second. So yeah, you've got it, and you're going deeper already, which is brilliant. I love this. I love the psychology behind all of this. So what I've got two real conflicting, real deep values. The audience may have some of these as well. That perhaps are not related to the sales specific persona, though. Thinking about it, but I have a crave for freedom. So I hate having a boss. I've always been a massive pain in the ass for sales managers to manage. I've always produced results, but I've always been a real pain, and I've always appreciated that. And I also have a drive for security. So when I say semi-retirement, what I mean is I have income coming in that if the podcast flopped, I'd feel okay from a financial perspective, not from a self-worth perspective, not anything like that, but from I could feed my family and kids kind of perspective. Yeah. But that is obviously massively conflicting with this idea of and this value of being free. If I was doing what I'm doing now, the hours I'm doing, which is easy 12 hours a day, and I was doing it for someone else, I would hate that person. I'd be jealous of them, and it's one of the reasons why I'm now doing a podcast rather than perhaps going back into another corporate sales role. Whereas, I could earn serious money in a corporate sales role doing the same hours that I'm doing. But perhaps it isn't as scalable, I accept that. But having that management and that tie down and those commitments and not being in control was something that really grated on me. So yeah, you're right. It's probably not the element of semi-retirement, those words. It's more the freedom and the valuing the security there as well.
Yeah, and say the deeper you go, the more you kind of find out where you really at. And and something with me, I've kind of always feared normality.
Yeah.
I didn't want the kind of the 3 or 4 bedroom house on the modern housing estate with the Ford Mondeo on the drive, and there's nothing wrong with that. Lots of people have that, but that was something I was kind of fearful of from as a young lad. And so I've always been kind of running away from that, and that's been part of my driver why I went into a role such as sales, because that gave me the flexibility to not have what I called a normal life and eventually build a business, etc. So again, it's you come back to your kind of why. If you were, let's just say, for example, making £100,000 a month profit from your business, would you still do your podcast? You probably would, because you like what you do, you love what you do, but there's a deeper reason. It could be coming back to you've been that sales guy working 12 hours a week for a boss you hated, and you want to help salespeople not be in that same position you're in. And it's finding that thing that drives you to do what you do, because you're working 12 hours a day now for probably not £100,000 a month, but you've got this goal to achieve more, but achieve more to do what? And this is why it comes back to the sales guys, when they're getting to know their customers. If they genuinely want to help their customers be successful, and there's a reason for that they can articulate, they will build better, stronger, deeper relationships. And it's the same with you. As you start to articulate your why in a way that's a lot deeper than it is now, your audience will start to remember you as he's the guy that wants to, save the sales world, or he's the guy that wants to get rid of all the sales managers and give the salespeople freedom, or whoever Will becomes. And it's, it takes a while to get there, but where I've seen it work, it works well.
And is that part of this as well, that you have to start, a bit hazy, and it does take time to narrow things down and to get the clarity there? And where I'm getting at is there's not just a formula for this. There's no quick fix. You need to study it, and is it almost the hero's journey kind of thing as well, of you start one end and you know where you want to go?
And the why will change. I mean, I don't know whether you mentioned this in the intro or not, but I run ultra marathons, and they could vary from 50 miles to 100 miles in a day, and longer. And I did a race in northern Canada in the winter. It's 450 miles over 12 days, kind of minus 40 degrees centigrade, camping in the snow and that kind of thing. But I had a massive, massive why to finish that race. And I had a series of things that would get me through that race. And when, there were some tough times, you can read about it on my website, youcandoit.co.uk. It's just a Tumblr blog. But I had a massive, massive why to get through that, and that got me through. And the why was, it was the last thing my mother would see me do before she died of cancer. She was following me on her iPad. We'd bought her an iPad before I went out there, and she was following me, and I knew I could not fail, because if I failed me, I failed her. So that was what drove me and don't get me wrong, there were times when I was ready to go home. I was like, I've had enough of this. I don't want to be out here anymore. But I knew, for my mum, it was the last thing she'd seen me do, and that got me through. So, and the why's changed. I'm doing another race this weekend coming, another 100-miler, and I have a very strong why to do it, and I will finish it. When we get to like 28 hours and we only just kind of haven't slept, I will finish it. But again, I've got a why. Whereas early on in the year, I did some races and I didn't finish them because I didn't want to. And it came to the point where actually, I'm bored with this race today. I'll go home early. Yeah. And you'll have that in sales. There'll be sometimes your heart isn't in it for whatever reason, and your why changes, as yours will, as you have children, etc. Your needs change.
I want to end on this point, and I've got a couple of questions to ask everyone that comes on the show, but I feel like this might even be the crux of our conversation here, Peter. So the whys come, they go, they change.
Yeah.
Is it possible to create a why or to emphasize a why right this second to motivate you? Clearly, the why you just described, and I've got a very similar one of myself. My mum, who passed away from cancer recently, I had a why for an event that I did before she passed away, and obviously that's situational. Is there always whys around us, and can we hook onto these and use them for motivation in the moment? Because it's almost the best intrinsic motivation that we've got to get stuff done, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it could be, something happens in the public domain. It could be, for example, there's a new focus on homeless people, let's say within the city you live in, and you go, actually, yeah, I want to do something with these homeless people. So I want to hit my sales target this month because I've decided I'm going to give 10% my bonus to the homeless people in Leicester or Nottingham or Birmingham or wherever you happen to be. So absolutely, there can be a genuine, true why that comes into your life totally unexpectedly, but people wouldn't normally share that with their prospects or their colleagues. They might go, nobody needs to know about that. And if you think about it, when people do the London Marathon and all these different things, they start raising money for charity. That's their why. That's what drives them through that process. So absolutely, yes, you can find something that's very specific right now that changes things for you.
Amazing. I think that in itself is just super powerful motivation for the audience. And I'll have a think about this, and I'll write some thoughts in the show notes of this episode as well. And with that, Peter, I've got a couple of questions to ask everyone that comes on the show. First one, and answer these as quick or as slow as you like. We can dive into them or we can keep them light. First one, running the cold or running the warm?
My preference is running in the cold. It's a bigger challenge. I've run through the jungle, the deserts, and the Arctic, so cold definitely.
Nice. And I like the way you see. So this is the whole point of this question, in that you chose a challenge then rather than what's easiest, which is insightful for the audience, I'm sure. What's the biggest deal that you've ever closed?
Probably about 10, 12 million pounds.
Nice. What's one book or resource that you'd recommend to the Salesman podcast audience?
One of my favorite books I always give to my clients at a certain point in their kind of coaching program is The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday.
Excellent book. I can recommend that as well, personally. Who is the world's greatest salesperson?
Thought about this. There's two. Best evil or best not so evil. So I would say in the technology world, I'd say Mark Benioff of Salesforce.com. Because he effectively, I kind of see he almost created the cloud.
Yep.
On not such a positive note, I would say the likes of Nigel Farage and Donald Trump are salespeople who are able to use their sales skills to get what they want, but not necessarily with a great why.
Yeah, I think, half the people who are listening have no idea who Nigel Farage is. He's retired now, I think, a politician in the UK from a smaller party, but he does a really good... I don't know how he does it. I've not really thought about the psychology behind him personally, but he seems like the politician that you could go to the pub with. It would be an awkward conversation because it might be slightly racist or however your viewpoints on it is, but it'd probably be a good laugh versus most of the other politicians who you'd perhaps go for a meal with and talk about politics, but you wouldn't want to converse with much further than that. So he's an interesting character for sure. And last one on these quickfire ones. What does the first 60 minutes of your day look like?
Okay, a little bit different to most probably. I have a 5-minute journal, so I complete my 5-minute journal first. I also check or update my to-do list. So I always have a top 3 things I have to do, then a following 3 things, and a maximum of 10 things on my to-do list. I have a little book I fill in. I then do half an hour of stretching. And I then walk my dogs for 10, 15 minutes, just so I can kind of think about my to-do list and what I'm going to be doing for the day. And then that's the first hour gone.
Nice. Do you eat in the first hour?
Not normally, no. No, I'll normally eat after that. And then very often have a cup of coffee probably in the house, kind of just maybe check email or whatever, or read some news, and then not get to the office normally until probably 9:30, 10 o'clock.
And your to-do list and all that, is that all handwritten?
Funnily enough, it is, yes. I have, on my wall behind me, I've got a 12-month plan, a 30, 60, 90-day plan, and a weekly planner. That's all done on the laptop and printed out. But my actual daily to-do list, I fill a small, I have a little small moleskin notebook, one of the small ones, and that's it, just handwritten.
Nice. Why handwritten?
Um, I like paper, and I still use paper, but I use Evernote books and paper kind of thing, so it's all scanned electronically.
Yeah.
But I just think with the writing piece, you remember it better. It's something you have to do, and the other thing that's in my to-do list, which comes from my sales training, I always have a list of 3 new contacts or connections I make every day, and I have to write those down. And if I don't write them down, I kind of almost go, oh, I've kind of failed. So
Nice. I appreciate that. I write everything down as well. I've got literally in front of you can't see on the camera, it's tons of paper. But I find, and I think there's been studies that show this as well, that when you physically write or go through the process of using your hand versus typing, it does stick in your brain easier. So I just write everything down, and then it sends, even though I don't use the paper again, perhaps it's still stuck in there. Awesome. Peter, I've got one final question for you. It's something that I've asked everyone that's come on the show so far, so I'm keen to get your insights to it. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at sales?
Oh, good question. I suppose I always tend to think to have been less rebellious, and probably, but I don't necessarily actually know. I think probably to have been a bit smarter politically. I was probably a bit too blunt with my opinions, and therefore politically that wasn't always the best move. But I kind of sit on the fence with that one a little bit, because you think, well, if I had been more political, where would I be now? Would I still be stuck in normality land? But that's one thing I've always kind of thought, well, yeah, maybe I should have been a bit more political.
Love it. I am 100% the same. If I was more political right now, I would be a sales manager within a $1 billion medical device company, one specific company in particular. And I've absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. And I would still be doing crazy hours and running around the country. And, could be happy doing that as well, because you've got the job security there, which is different to running your own business and that side of things. So I appreciate that. And I feel like, we're on the same wavelength for some of these things. And with that, I really enjoyed our conversation, Peter. I want you to tell us a little bit about your book, and then tell us, the audience, where we can find out more about you personally, if they've enjoyed this conversation and they want to dive in a bit deeper to your world.
Okay. So the book, just finished it, called The Growth Factor. And factor is spelt FAKTOR, which actually comes from my ultra running. Factor is kind of focus, ability, kit, team, opportunities, and resistance. So I kind of use that framework when I'm doing a new race, and I use that framework now in business. So, and there's a website, growthfactor.com, so you can have a look at that. And probably the best place to find me is LinkedIn or Twitter. PeterGold99 on Twitter and on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Well, we'll link to that all in the show notes for anyone who is running or training for a marathon at the moment and they're trying to scribble this down on the hand as they're sprinting along. It'll be in the show notes over at salesman.red. And with that, Peter, I genuinely, mate, I really enjoyed today's conversation. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your questions, mate. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman podcast.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
And there we have it. Peter, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for the back and forth as well. I appreciate that, rather than a canned Q&A interview, which I try and avoid as much as possible. So I appreciate you asking the questions. I took value personally out of this episode as well, which is awesome. Sales Nation, as always, I say this every episode, but I really do mean it. Thank you for sharing your attention and your time with me. Hopefully you got a lot out of this episode as well. And with all that said, I'll speak with you again on tomorrow's show.